Hi, this is Mrs. Wiederhold, and welcome to my lesson video on conic sections, recognizing standard equations. Now let's get started. Just as each conic has a typical shape, well, each conic also has a typical equation. This typical equation form is known as the standard form of the equation. It's also referred to just as the standard equation. Now, I'm sure most of these equations look the same to you right now, but there are some differences, and we will go over those differences one at a time. In all four of these examples, the capital letters are just there to represent miscellaneous numbers, meaning they could be ones, twos, threes, tens, whatever. But the x's and y's are there to represent x's and y's that would be in the actual equation for that conic section. So now let's look at the equation for the parabola. In this equation, the most important thing to notice is that there is only one squared term in the whole equation. Now let's look at the equation for the circle. There are three distinct features. First, there are two squared terms. The second feature is that both terms have the same sign. If you notice the first term, since you do not see a sign in front, that means it's positive. And if you look in front of the second term, it is also positive. The third feature is that the coefficient in each of the squared terms will be the same number, meaning you could have 3x squared plus 3y squared. You could simply have x squared plus y squared. But both coefficients will be the same. So let me just repeat these three features. The first feature is that there will be two squared terms in a circle. The second feature is that the squared terms will both have the same sign. They usually will both be positive. And then the third feature is that the coefficients of each squared term will be the same. Now let's look at the ellipse. Now this equation, there are only really two features that are important for us to know about. The first one is that there will be two squared terms. And the second feature is that both of the squared terms will have the same sign, usually positive. Now, it is also important to know that the coefficients themselves will not be the same. Only in the circle will the coefficients be exactly the same. Now let's look at the equation for the hyperbola. It also has two features. The first feature, yes, there are two squared terms. And for the second feature, what looks different from the equation of the hyperbola and the equation of the ellipse? If you say the minus sign, you're correct. The two coefficients in the hyperbola will have different signs. Usually the first one will be positive and the second one there will be a minus sign. Now let's look at some examples. There are three questions that can help you determine the type of conic equation you have. So let's go through the questions. The questions merely help you remember what I just shared with you on the previous slide. So question number one, are both variables squared? Well, if the answer is no, then you have a parabola. If the answer is yes, you go to the next test or the next question. So let's look at question number two. Do the squared terms have opposite signs? If the answer is yes, you have an hyperbola, and if the answer is no, then you go to the final test or question. And that is, are the squared terms multiplied by the same number? And what that means, do they have the same coefficient? If the answer is yes, it's a circle. If the answer is no, it's an ellipse. So let's try using these questions to determine which conic section goes with each of these four equations. So looking at example A, I'm going to ask the question, are both variables squared? And the answer is yes, they are. So that means I need to go to the next question. Do the squared terms have opposite signs? Well, the answer is no, they don't. So that means I have to go to the third test, or the third question. Are the squared terms multiplied by the same number? Meaning, do they have the same coefficient? And yes, they do, so that means we have a circle. Now let's look at example B. Are both variables squared? In this equation, I only have one squared term. So the answer to this question would be no, both variables are not squared. So that means I have a parabola. Now let's look at example C. Are both variables squared? And yes, I have two squared variables, so that means I need to go to the next question. Do the squared terms have opposite signs? Well, the answer is no. They both have the same sign. So that means I go to the third question. Are the squared terms multiplied by the same number? Meaning, do they have the same coefficient? And the answer is no, they don't. This x squared has the coefficient of 1 and y squared has the coefficient of 2. So that means I have an ellipse. Now let's look at example D. Are both variables squared? Well, yes, they are. So I will go to the next question. Do the squared terms have opposite signs? And this time our answer is yes. I have an invisible positive sign in front of x squared and a minus or negative sign in front of y squared. So that means we stop here because we have an hyperbola. Now, this all might seem a little confusing at first, but once you practice it a few times, you'll see that it's pretty easy to recognize which equation goes with which conic section. Now, I hope that this video has helped you, and I look forward to working with you again. Bye-bye.